great year. I'm Mark Harkness, for those that I haven't met. Have been chemical engineer, worked in the business, chemical engineering business, petrochemicals, chemicals for about 20 years, and I've almost 20 years been working in the water arena, and so that's what I do, I'm a water guy. Just wanted to shout out to our sponsors that we've had, Business Climate Leaders, Citizens Climate Lobby, Microorganics. Appreciate their support. We do have sponsorship opportunities for any one or entity that would be interested in supporting the South Texas section. Would love to speak with you any more about that, but we have several levels of sponsorships. This information's on the website if you want to look at it a little more, but I would love to speak with you about that. Just wanted to say a big thanks to a lot of people in this room, or a number of those that have helped to make the South Texas section grow, make the South Texas section survive and thrive. We do have some new officers for this year. Ramanan, is he here? I don't think I saw him. He's our new chair-elect. Tom is now the past chair as of December 31st at 11:59 p.m. He texted me and said, "It's yours." Our new secretary for this year is Joseph Hernandez. I know he couldn't be here. Yurika is, again, treasurer. Baba, I have not seen him, but he is, again, the education officer. Nabila, is Nabila here? I have not seen him. Nabila, I'm sorry. Nabila is our new outreach officer this year. Megan is continuing communication officer, and William is our human resource officer. Just a large number of individuals. I'm not going to try and read every name, but these are a number of people that have helped with all sorts of activities and initiatives within the section. And still more. Thank you all for your help in moving the section along. Go ahead. Just a note, we have our networking lunches first Friday and third Friday of each month. We didn't have one this month because of the proximity to the holidays on first Friday. But we will be having our third Friday at the Pipeline Grill it's on Spencer Highway in Deer Park. And then February 7th will be our first Friday networking luncheon. Nomination time for the section's annual awards. Nominations will be accepted through May 1st for Best Applied Paper, Best Fundamental Paper, Best in Practice Paper Award, which is a new award, Outstanding Young Professional Award under 40, Distinguished Service Award over 36, and the South Texas Section Special Service Award. So please, if you have a nominee in mind, please pass that along. The nomination forms are on the website, or contact Matt, Tom, or Ryan. This is something that's been going on for a number of years, and for someone that's thinking about getting their PE, I can only speak for myself. It's one of the smarter things I've done was to get my license and maintain my license. But the section has a review course this spring. The first class is on January 31st. It's at U of H main campus.
And it's awesome.
Have you been to it? You can contact Dale Embry for more details, or information is on the website. I know it's there because I looked at it today. Okay.
You might also want to mention that the 4 years of experience has been decoupled from the PE exam.
Yes. The 4 years of experience has been decoupled from the PE exam, so you can take it basically anytime after you've taken the EIT.
Yep.
So that's something new. We did not have that option. The registration deadline is January 17th. So if you are inclined, please go on the website and sign up. Lucas, I'm going to let Lucas talk about the young professional activities.
Hi everyone, my name is Lucas Von Ruff. I'm going to be the YP chair for this year. Thank you. I just wanted to say that there's going to be a happy hour event next Friday on the 17th at Fuego Saloon on Washington Avenue. The address is 817 Durham, but it's in that Washington Avenue area. It's going to happen from 4 o'clock to 7 o'clock. Please show up. We will have some of the new YP leaders as well show up. If you're a YP, then I highly suggest coming to this, especially if you want to get more involved with other YP events this year. If you want to RSVP, go ahead and talk to me, or email the email address STS-AIChE.org. Just as we've been doing for the past few years, we are participating in Houston Engineers Week, and a part of that is selling raffle tickets for a Houston Rockets game. Every year we do this to support the local scholarships that E-Week does. They give it out to students in the local areas, such as U of H, A&M, Rice, all the other schools. The price for one ticket is $20. If you want to buy 6 of those tickets, it's $100. The drawing is going to be on Friday, February 21st at the gala. We'll be selling some at the end of this meeting. If you want to pay in cash or by check, you can just go ahead and talk to me. But if you want to think about it and email me later, go ahead and email that same address. I don't have the online link with me, but I can go ahead and direct people to it after this meeting. Also, as a part of Engineers Week, there's going to be the Run of Pie for 2020. It's going to be at McGregor Park, which is just outside of the University of Houston. This is another benefit. This is another program that benefits STEM programs for the local schools in the form of grants, so they can raise money. The date of that is going to be that Saturday before E-Week starts on the 15th of February. Start time is 8 a.m., but you can go ahead and get in the line for registration at 7 o'clock. Address is up there. There is a link to register online. There's also more details about it. It's open to not just runners, but if you want to be in a team of runners or volunteer, then there are opportunities for that. If you are interested in volunteering, go ahead and contact Ksenia Kozakis. I think Mark should go ahead and after the meeting is over, go ahead and leave these up so that way you can see this or talk to me after. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas. As I think probably most of you know, the section has been involved with and supported the OTC. And again, this year we're looking for volunteers. It's 4th through 7th of May at Energy Park. Volunteers will receive a free pass, free parking, all the free things and goodies and giveaways that you can carry. And you can attend technical sessions. We'd like to get volunteers before April 13th. Doing some K through 12 events involved with the food bank, mentoring program that we're getting started up, Energy Day in October, career fair workshop, science and engineering fair. If you would like to be a judge, I've already signed up, but you can still sign up. If you'd like to be a judge at the Science and Engineering Fair, it's a lot of fun. Registration table greeters or work, again, volunteer for the OTC. If you're interested, please, please let me or one of the other officers know.
For the science fair, contact me.
Okay, science fair contact Matt.
Matt Kolodny.
Matt Kolodny, thank you. Just a reminder, our next dinner meeting is Thursday, February 6th at the Holiday Inn Intercontinental Airport, 15222 JFK Boulevard, which is basically the southeast intersection of JFK and Beltway 8. And the speaker at the next dinner meeting is Mr. James Shelton with OSHA. And we have some awards that we are pleased to give out here, awards as well as some recognition. The Southwest Process Technology Conference in October, Dr. Matthew Berg was recognized as for the best presentation, and we have an award for him, as well as something else. Thank you, Matthew. Next, we'd like to recognize our outgoing or our last year's Young Professional Chair, Emily Jackson. She did a splendid job in running and working with the Young Professional section. And we really appreciate it. Last but not least, our now past chair, Mr. Tom Rim, Dr. Tom.
You put excellent job on it?
Yeah. We really do appreciate the effort and the time that you folks have put in. Does anyone have any announcements that may have been overlooked? Yes. Season passes. Yes. Yes. Season passes. I signed up for mine tonight, and if you would like to sign up for season pass, please see Eureka this evening. Starting next month, the meal for the monthly meeting is going to go up $5. So take advantage of the savings while you can. So,
Mark, I think this is the last opportunity, isn't it?
yes. Yeah, this is the last opportunity for a season pass.
So you probably need to see Rick on the way out.
Now,
Yeah. Well, you probably need to talk, if they haven't bought it yet, do they still have a chance?
Yes, they can buy it today. And if
Yes.
They pay for the ticket, they pay for the ticket for the dinner tonight.
see
I can
Eureka
give them at the-
before you leave.
Yeah, we can make all sorts of deals today, guys.
Thank you.
I mean, do the math. Think about the savings. I mean, it's fantastic. Do it. Just do it. With that, I'd like to take, I've got, according to my watch, 8:52. If we could, 7:52. If we could reconvene at 8:02, and our after dinner speaker, David Merchant, will give a presentation about the next evolution and the shale oil revolution, the good, the bad, the ugly, the carbon storage solution. So, take 5. Yeah. Hello? Like to get started here. Full disclosure, I was smart enough to print out a copy of David's bio, but I was not smart enough to bring it with me. However, David Merchant is a reservoir engineer with 44 years of oil and gas experience. He started his career with Amoco in 1976, where he worked 4 years in the Gulf of Mexico, 2 years at Amoco's Research Center in Reservoir Simulation, 4 years in the Africa and Middle East region, and 8 years in the Permian Basin. After Amoco, he spent 3 years at Pennzoil working with Permian Basin oil fields. He began his consulting career 22 years ago in 1998 with Shell CO2 Company. Since then, he has consulted for major oil companies, Shell, Marathon, Oxy Permian, BP Alternative Energy, and others, and independent companies such as Denbury, Hillcorp, and others. His carbon capture experience started 20 years ago while consulting for Los Alamos in the formation of the regional partnerships. His CO2 sequestration experience includes basin study analysis, scoping model predictions, reservoir modeling, and reservoir management. His current focus is to partner with AIChE, SPE, and shale oil operators in the Permian Basin to put out the flare from unconventional shale oil wells while achieving 2 times or even 3 times primary oil recovery. I'd like to welcome Mr. David Merchant. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I got it.
You got it.
We're good. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. And it's really nice to be here, too. And along those lines, this is something that I normally don't do when I give presentations, but today is a little bit different. So what I really wanted to do is focus on why I'm here, who I am, and what can I bring in terms of bringing to the table in regards to SPE versus AIChE. So from this standpoint, why am I here? Well, I met Tom Ream back in July at the Carbon Management Technology Conference, where I was giving a paper at the time. And that paper was CO2 sequestration, enhanced oil recovery, CO2/EOR, huff and puff in the 21st century. So what I want to do today or tonight is talk about things that we've done in the oil industry over the last 48 years in the CO2 business, but mostly focus in on enhanced oil recovery with shale oil, because since it's brand new. And then why am I here also as well? I saw a climate solutions community as a place where people and companies from different parts of the world can come together to develop climate solutions to solve today's climate issues, which to me is just something that I've been trying to do for 22 years, but mostly on the SPE side. And it gets back into, you know, looking at basins, looking at evaluations in regards to what the world will look like in 2050, you know, what from that perspective. And I put this together is just as a slide, just to try to what I call look at the other side of the fence. Well, this is actually look at the other side of the bridge from the standpoint is that I view the climate solutions community as a place that we all can sit down and talk, and we can actually work out solutions for climate issues. And then I also want to thank Tom Ream and Mark Harkness for allowing me to present tonight. So who am I? Well, if you keep adding up all the things, I'm about 300 years old. But I've had 44 years in the petroleum business. I've had 34 years of CO2 flooding experience. I've had 22 years of consulting experience. And my clientele is that originally, as Mark had mentioned, is the fact I started out with Amoco. I had 18 years with Amoco. It was great. I had 3 years with Pennzoil. Well, Pennzoil was at, the first year they hired 25 of us. We all had 15 to 25 years of experience. The second year there was 15 of us left. And then the third year there was 4 of us left, and I got marched out of the building too. Well, at that time I had friends with Shell CO2 Company, which at that time only had about 6, president, vice president, it was only about 6 or 8 of us. And I went into Shell, and Shell had a hiring freeze on. I said, oh, this is pretty good. And so my salary was this low, and then the second year was like, oh, this is pretty good. So then it went up. And then Shell CO2 Company got bought out by, or formed Kinder Morgan CO2 Company. And now they're the second largest producer, or at least they were, the second largest producer in Texas. And it's expanded and grown and all that kind of stuff. But I elected to start my consulting career 22 years ago. And I've consulted for a bunch of different companies, BP, mostly BP Alternative Energy, Oxy Permian, Maersk, Marathon. Maersk was great because I got spent 2 months in Copenhagen between July 15th, or between May 15th and July 15th, which in Copenhagen is beautiful, except the sun goes down at 10 o'clock at night and comes up at 10 o'clock, or comes in up at about 4 o'clock in the morning. But anyway, and then I've been involved with consortiums, the carbon capture program through BP Alternative Energy. I've been involved with seal sequestration, starting out with the Los Alamos when the regional partnerships got formed many, many years ago. Actually, about 20 years ago. And then the problem with that was that I'm a consultant. Well, all the money from a government standpoint through the program ended up going out to universities. So I got sidelined on that trip, but anyway. And then I've worked for small independent companies, managed properties for Petro Santander in one of their CO2 floods, and I've dealt with some other things. But with 34 years of reservoir engineering experience in CO2s, this is an area that I, even at age 70, feel like, what's retirement? If somebody's willing to pay me to go to China or something to teach school. So, consulting career, who am I? 22 years. America's truly a great place. I've conducted basin studies. I've done CO sequestration projects. I've managed CO2 projects across the United States. So what I want to do also is get into that in terms of things that I've done. In terms of basin study analysis, here's the Gulf Coast, Permian Basin, Rocky Mountain region for different companies like that. And this is something that I call in basin studies is what would the world look like in the year 2050? And then I've also been involved with clean coal and clean gas projects, mostly in California. I was involved with Wilmington Thumbs Unit. Wilmington Thumbs Unit is an offshore field in Los Angeles. BP was going to sequester CO2 out of the refinery in Los Angeles, pipe it 6 miles across, and then dump it into Long Beach Harbor, where there's 6 islands out there. People don't understand, but there's also 1,500 wells. And I had Tony Blair on one side and Schwarzenegger on the other, and it was going back and forth. And I'm looking at it. They're not going to put CO2 into Los Angeles. It's just not going to happen. So they moved my project up to Elk Hills. I got involved with that, the HECA project, and this went on for another year and things like that. And then all these projects, and then I got involved with the Kimberlina project in California too, of sequestering CO2 out of a gas plant. And I say that a gas plant in terms of electrical power plant. It's an oxy-fuel plant. But you could sequester, the idea was that you could generate CO2 and generate electricity, then take the CO2 and inject it into the reservoir that was next to it. Well, all the 3 of these projects went away in BP from that standpoint. It's a real tough world out there from an economic perspective. And then, but I've also gotten involved with, I do tracking programs in terms of monitoring CO2 performance in fields, whether they're conventional WAG or whether gravity drainage and things like that. And I've written Fortran programs over the years. If people know what a Fortran program is. And I've had a lot of fun with that too. And then from a consulting standpoint is that what I really like to do is also teach. And so I've got 3 websites, one CO2 storage solutions, one owns CO2 reservoir management solutions, and then the last one's is to do CO2 seminars on wheels. And this has allowed me to teach class. I taught class for Global CCS Institute in China, which was great because they paid for me and my wife to go there. Spent 2 days of teaching and then 10 days of traveling around. So that was a lot of fun too. So the outline of the talk, this is what we're going to talk about tonight. And what I really want to do is kind of give you an oversight in what we've learned over the last 48 years of CO2 flooding in the United States. And to first talk about conventional CO2 flood and flood history and conventional WAG. And then I want to get into what I call new millennium, and this is after 2000, and specifically target more the Permian Basin. And this deals with unconventional shale oil recovery. And then the last thing I want to do is talk about the Gulf Coast, and I want to get your thoughts into it in regards to, you know, where we're headed with this. So this is the outline of the talk. I'm going to start out right now. I'm talking about CO2 flood history and what we've learned in the Permian Basin. And then since 1972, there have been over 130 projects. Production is up over 350,000 barrels of oil a day, and we've got about 4,500 miles of pipeline. This is the Permian Basin. It's about 300 by 250 miles. This is the Permian Basin. Well, let's go back about 300 million years ago. But from that standpoint, is that when you talk about the Permian Basin, there's a central basin platform, which is this portion right here, contains stacked reservoirs in here. And then there's, on the flanks, there's the Midland Basin and the Delaware Basin, and this is where the shale gets produced from. These are actually the source rocks for these limestone formations that were laid down 300 million years ago. And since production 1866 in Texas, ever since that time is that most of the oil productions, the big oil productions come out of the Permian Basin. And we're talking about billions of barrels of oil in place. And then we're talking about from a time frame standpoint, this is Permian age rocks. It's about 250 to 300 million years ago. And we're down about 5,000 to 8,000 feet in depth. And this is important, and I'll get to that in just a minute too. And then you've got the basins on each side of it, which are for the shale oil portion of it. And then the shale oil portion convenes, and we talk about formations like the Bone Springs or the Wolf Camp or Wolfberry and things like that in terms of where we're drilling wells to today in the horizontals or in the unconventional world. And these reservoirs are about 8,000 to 12,000 feet deep. In fact, I'm going to switch over here just a second. Nope, just not. So let's go back to 1972 to 2000, the previous millennium. Was what I call life below 80% hydrocarbon pore volume injected. And I'll tell you what that means in just a minute. But back in 1972, the Sack Rock unit was drilled at that time. It's about 3 billion barrels of oil in place. You can see all the wells drilled here. There's also the city of Snyder that's also above this too. So it's not like you have to have these fields separated from cities. Cities actually grew up over these fields. It's not that much different than Houston. And then if you look at this through history, and there's a lot of different things on here too, but this goes, first production was in 1948, and oil is green, water is blue, and red is CO2 injection. So you've got oil production that started in 1954. It peaked in about 1972 around 209,000 barrels of oil a day. And you'll also notice that CO2 injection started at this same time, along with water injection too. And there was different operators here. Chevron was the first operator. Chevron sprinkled, what I call sprinkled CO2 into this reservoir. There wasn't that much put in any one pattern. So the field was really never flooded. And when I was with Pennzoil with this, we recognized that. And we put a pilot program. But we were never really to get to production up. We level loaded production, basically. And then Pennzoil went down the tubes. They sold the field to Devon. And then the same time when I was talking about with Kinder Morgan got formed into Shell CO2 company. I was in the data room buying it because I knew the field had never really been flooded at that time. And then Kinder Morgan came in. In fact, well, let me go back. This little pilot here, 300-acre pilot, flattened the oil production in oil production at this rate or during this time frame, which is that one little block was all that red production right there. So there was a significant amount of potential that existed in this field that Chevron never really, even though they said they CO2 flooded it, they never really put enough in it. So we recognized that fact. Kinder Morgan came in, ramped up CO2 injection, about 800 million a day, and then here comes oil production, and it went up to 33,000 barrels of oil a day. It's still making 33,000 barrels a day. It's a tremendous field. But this gives you some kind of insight. Usually what happens is you get primary oil production, you go out, you drill wells, you do secondary water flood production, it goes in, and then the third oil recovery mechanism is CO2, tertiary. And then I want to also talk about 10 CO2 operating methods that had been developed during this time. I want to do is give thanks to George Caperna, who was Advanced Resources International, and also Jose Figuerina, who was at the NETL, for allowing me to publish over the last, since 2015, 2017, and now in 2019 to publish papers on it. In 2015, let me hit this then. 2015, I published a paper. It's called Life Beyond 80 to look at conventional WAG recovery beyond 80% hydrocarbon pore volume in CO2 tertiary floods. And then in 2017, I did a more of an advanced evaluation on it, where I looked at enhanced oil recovery, the history of CO2 conventional WAG techniques developed from lab to 1917, or to 1950s to 1917. So the first paper in 2015 dealt with conventional WAG recovery mechanisms. And this deals with what the reservoir looks like. Excuse me. What the reservoir looks like, what's the best recovery mechanism that you can use in order to do that. And that falls in line with conventional WAG recovery. There's a residual oil zone target. There's gravity drainage, which is if you got stacked or something that you can put CO2 at the top and flood down instead of flooding from sideways. And then you got double displacement, which is the same, similar, really what goes along the along the Gulf Coast. And then you got gas cycling, huff and puff, heavy oil, shale oil now, which was under investigation back in 2015, horizontal well development, and then CO2 gas drive with nitro boost, which is adding two nitrogen along with the CO2. Conventional oil recovery involves about 90% of the floods in the Permian Basin. And just to give you an idea is that, this is what an electric log would look like. And in this particular field, normally the oil would be from the top of the formation all the way down the bottom. In the Permian Basin, through time, the Permian Basin shifted. And what that allowed is oil to get moved out of the Permian Basin, and you're stuck with what we call residual oil zone. And that's where we can go in and we first target main oil, and then we go back and target the residual oil saturation, or the fields that have that. And then Okay, this was this is conventional oil black recovery. And as I mentioned, this was Seminole Field. In terms of what we've learned over the last 40 years is that back in the 1980s and 1986, we only thought that recovery was 7 to 12%. And that was a 30 by 40% hydrocarbon pore volume injected. That's the percentage of a box, basically. And then in 2000, we got that up to 18%. Now we're talking about anywhere up to about 30%. But you put more CO2 into it, and you cycle more CO2 through it. And so that's what we've learned, and that's where we've come from the conventional world. Now what I want to do is, and then we talk about gravity drainage and double displacement, and this kind of a field is that it's got structure to it. It's got a lot of structure, and you can put CO2 in the top of it, and you can flood down. And from this standpoint, we got the Yates Field, which is in the Permian Basin. It's a beautiful field also. Worked on it for Marathon and different companies. And so then you got gravity drainage. Then you got gas cycling. This is done by Denbury, mostly in Mississippi. And this has to do with cycling CO2 through the reservoir without any water or anything like that. And you get good recovery out of that too. And then we got Huff and Puff. And from a conventional world standpoint, we got 100 projects that do this. Huff and Puff is where you inject CO2 into a well, and then you soak it, and then you produce it. And then I'll talk about that when I get into more of the conventional world. And then there's heavy oil, and this gets back to Wilmington Offshore Thumbs Unit. This is Los Angeles. And the rigs that are here are all covered like they look like they're sides of buildings. So it doesn't look like it's an oil. But there's 1,500 wells out here on 4 different islands. And that's 14 API gravity crude. There was actually 3, in the 1980s, there was 3 pilots in this area. They all made oil with CO2. And what you would expect in heavy oil with CO2 is the CO2 would just cycle through it. And you wouldn't recover very much. But what we proved is the fact that since the world is compositional, and you guys know a lot about composition, is that from a compositional standpoint, heavy oils, if you add the CO2 to it, is that you recover a lot of oil, and you don't cycle as much CO2 through it. So it really depends on what the formation is, what the composition is, and what the minimum miscibility is, and things like that. And then there's shale oil in the Bakken. In 2015, this was still under investigation. But we're talking about drilling long horizontals. This is what they're doing in the unconventional. And these could be 2 miles long. It's pretty significant. And then horizontal well drilling patterns are something that evolved also over the last 20 or 30 years. And so, whether it's horizontals or whether it's verticals, it still can be done. And then the last one is gas drive with nitro boost. And this gets back to my Kern County evaluation that I did. I actually applied for a patent on this, but if you put the CO2 in first into a gravity drainage type reservoir, then you can go in and chase it with nitrogen, and from an economic standpoint, you accelerate it. And you improve your economics. Well, I thought it was great because here the Kimberlina plant I've got, it's oxy-fuel. It gets six molecules of nitrogen and 1 molecule of CO2. Well, the question was, what can you do with the nitrogen? Okay, well, if I can chase it in the reservoir and speed things up, then things really look a lot better from an economic perspective. So I thought I'd apply for a patent on it. I didn't get approved. But it was only the first time through, too. So, plus, there's a lot of research that's been done over the last 50 or 100 years. So anyway, now an 11th, what I call 11th CO2 recovery mechanism, really deals with deep saline reservoirs. And the Bureau of Economic Geology, Scott Tinker, back in 2000, I guess this was 2001 or 2, gave a presentation that said, yeah, we can sequester about 220 gigatons of CO2 in the Gulf Coast. And that really only represents about 3% of the pore volume. So it's significant. And then I also like to throw this out, is that from a reservoir engineering standpoint, in terms of what we do on the SPE side, is that, yeah, when we sit down maybe every 6 weeks or so, but we sit down as a team and we go through evaluating on a pattern-by-pattern basis exactly what's going on in the field and then what we can do in order to change it and make improvements on it. But it's truly a team effort. And it can conclude geologists too, so. Now let's move to the 21st century, and I call 2000 beyond. It's called what I call life beyond 80% hydrocarbon. This is where we get out to 26, 28% recovery. And then, as I mentioned earlier, is that, yeah, I'm 7 to 12% back in the 80s, 18 to 18% during the 2000s, and now we're at 26. Unconventional oil recovery. Now, so I'm moving up on the outline. Now, I really want to key in on unconventionals. And when I talk about unconventionals, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. And then I want to talk about an introduction of CO2 huff and puff, and exactly what that is. And then I'm going to talk about Oxy in terms of some of the modeling work that they've done to show that oil recovery could be 2 times or 3 times what they're getting today. And then from my perspective, since I do scoping model analysis and basin study analysis, is that what would a 40 by 50 square mile area in the Permian Basin look like? And what that really represents is 1,000 pads. And each pad has 8 wells to it. And they're drilled out over a large area. And then, but when you really look at it in terms of how much CO2 can you store in that area, it's about 4.5 trillion cubic feet. That's a significant amount of storage capacity. So the new millennium, 21st century, this is 2005 and beyond. This is when shale oil really started kicking off. So we got about 15 years worth of shale oil. And this is what I call the next evolution in the shale oil recovery. It's not primary unconventional recovery, where you go out and what they do today is drill, baby, drill. They go out and they drill these wells and they're down, and they cost $6 or $8 million a piece, which I used to be able to drill a well for $150,000 and only get down to 5,000 feet. Well, these go out for 2 miles. And today it's only primary recovery. They only do 1 cycle. So you go out there, you drill the well, and you produce it one time. And the oil rate drops. Oil rate may start off 1,000 barrels of oil a day, and then within a year or 2 years, it's down to 10 or 15 barrels a day. So you got to keep a continuing drill. It's drill, baby, drill in order to stay in business. And then along those lines, what we've also learned in terms of that, if we combine huff and puff, what we learned from the conventional world with shale oil, now we've got a whole brand new tertiary recovery mechanism. It's not primary, what we've had. It's not secondary with water, because water doesn't work, but it's tertiary, it's CO2. And then, along with those lines, the shale oil industry has developed 3 areas in the United States. There's the Bakken up here in the north part of like North Dakota, and it actually extends way up into Canada. And then which is here, same thing as the Bakken. And then in the Permian Basin, you've got the Permian Basin, and then down in South Texas, you've got Eagle Ford. So but all 3 of these are different kinds of formations too. I mean, there are different kinds of rock, different methodologies in regards to how to approach it. So now I want to talk about the good. Well, the shale oil revolution, from a good standpoint, is that we're up 12 million barrels a day since 2005 because of that. The United States perspective, we're holding the global leader in recoverable oil. This is where we are today. If we didn't have this, it'd be a little bit different than what's going on in the Middle East right now, because you're hostage from that standpoint. But I wanted to point out is that from a shale oil revolution, this is 2014 to 2019, you can see the significance in regards to the Permian basins versus Eagle Ford versus Bakken versus Niobrara. And then you've got natural gas regions too that are supplying natural gas, that shutting in the coal-powered power plants so that you've got gas-powered power plants. So from a United States perspective, we're the global leader, and we're also became an exporter of oil for the first time. We got 293 billion barrels of recoverable oil reserves. It beats out Saudi Arabia, and it beats out Russia by 20 billion barrels, or 100 billion barrels respectively. And then these tight oil plays hold at least 100 billion barrels of oil in place. And that, or 100 billion barrels of recoverable oil, and a lot of that doesn't really deal with tertiary. It really deals with what we know today in terms of primary. So benchmarks, achievements. Yeah, we're 12.2 million barrels of oil a day. We're up here where we were compared to where we were before, or we would be down here. Both Texas and Gulf have reached new highs of 4.97 million barrels a day, or 1.98 million barrels a day. Oklahoma's also set new records in terms of 617,000 barrels a day. You've got the EI in terms of, it says that 61% of the U.S. production, or 7.4 million barrels a day, comes from dry rock formations. And then the Permian Basin accounts for 63% of the production in Texas, 96% of the production in New Mexico. And then from January 2018 to 2019, crude oil production increased by 1.1 million barrels a day. That's significant, too. And then, as I also mentioned, I said U.S. exports could increase by current levels of about another 3 million barrels a day by 2022. And this gets back to the pipelines that are coming from the Permian Basin, headed toward the Gulf and headed toward your refineries and everything like that. And then, but in order to do this, you've got to drill 20,000 wells a year. That's really significant, and in order to maintain this, though, too. But the reason they can do this and why the production is so high is called DUCs. These are drilled, uncompleted wells. So they go out and they drill the wells and keep drilling wells, and they've done this to have an oversupply of wells versus going out and just drilling a well, completing it, drilling a well. So you've got all these drilled, uncompleted wells out there that are going to fill the gap in times when oil price drops, and that's exactly what's going on right now. And this includes about 8,000 wells that have been drilled but uncompleted. So essentially what we've got to do is a nest full of locations that are already drilled, and then all you do is complete them. It's a safety net. And it gives you technology provides a quick entrance back into the arena. And then there's also integrated solutions that are going on too in the Permian Basin also, which includes solar. It includes other things too in terms of of improving things, not just relying on old technology. Now let's talk about the bad. You got the good, 12,000 barrels a day. Now you get the bad. Oh, this is a plot of rig count through time in different areas of the world, and I know I didn't put down the name. You can't see the names on here, but every one of them, production has dropped since the shale oil revolution. And then, and you can see this in terms of Baker Hughes well count reports. Boom, boom, boom. So people being laid off, all kinds of things going on all around the world. And so, but you've also got what I call premature decommissioning of the North Sea. If it wasn't for shale oil, the North Sea would be doing CO2 recovery. Tertiary oil recovery was destined to be there. It just didn't happen. And a lot of it has to do with economics. And when it gets back down to today, decommissioning will plug 4,000 wells along with the removal of 300 platforms and 20,000 kilometers of pipelines that cost about 35 billion pounds. So what we've essentially done, what with shale oil is in fact walk away from the North Sea, because it's going to cost us a lot more to go back, put those pipelines back in to recover that oil. And then the last thing here in terms of oil bust, and I say this because normally they talk about the oil bust happening in 2014 and 2015. Well, oil bust over that 2-year period, 150,000 people, energy people, were out of work. Baker Hughes cut 26,000 people. Schlumberger was 10,000 people. Southwest Energy 1,000 people. Halliburton 4,000 people. Weatherford 6,000. Anadarko 1,000. And now with Oxy buying out Anadarko, they just went through another layoff period. It's normal scheme of things. ConocoPhillips, another 1,000 jobs. Shell cut 25% of its deep water Gulf jobs, in 2016. You know, and it goes on and on. Schlumberger, Halliburton, things like that. And it's still going on. It may not have affected your side of the business, but as much as it did on the production side. So, but it's also self-inflicting. From the standpoint is that, you know, it's boom, 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 or bust, bust, bust. And then Wall Street always wins out versus the workforce. And even today, and this is 2019, July 24th, Halliburton reported 8% of its work staff would be laid off. Whiting was 33%, and Pioneer Resources was 25%. Pioneer Resources is one of the biggest players in the Permian Basin in shale oil. So it's self-inflicting. I mean, you're so good that they dropped the oil price down into $40, $50 range, and this is where we are today. Excuse me. Now, is Permian's future up or down? And when you talk to the president of Pioneer Natural Resources, you know, he says that he expects oil price would remain about the same, and that most of the area in the Permian Basin has already been proved up or been drilled, or the better tier 1 places. So I got audience participation. I don't do this very often. But what I want to do is I said, so what do you think the prediction is going to be on this? And what I'm showing right now is I got a rig count. This is a historical plot. And here we are today. This was back in January 2019 there. So, and then on the right is future oil production scenarios, looking at different scenarios. And this is 2019. So what I'd like to know, do you think it's going to be this prediction, this, you know, such and such? So what I'm going to do, I want to ask you, raise your hands, is that do you think the oil price or oil production is going to drop down on this level? No? There's somebody running for president, and I think she thinks it's without oil production or shale oil, it's going to drop. Question? Or... Oh, okay. Oh, you're the first one. Okay. Next one, think it's going to be a little higher? Okay. Next. Okay. And I didn't, well, one other, and the last one. You think it's going to go that high? We've got pipeline capacity could do that. But you see that over there? All right. Personally, I think it's going to stay flat. American technology is great from that standpoint. We keep reinventing the wheel and keep improving things like that, and it shows that way. Now I want to talk about the ugly. And when you look at the ugly in the Permian Basin, you really got to talk about flare history, and it's across America too, and the world. It's the amount of associated gas not available for market and is flared. And then in the Permian Basin, I show about 800 million a day But it's actually, I think today it may be over BCF a day. So now let's talk about solutions to this. And this is carbon management solutions. CO sequestration. You know, how do you put my question is, how do you put the flare out? And I say that because I was at the Midland CO2 conference in December, a couple of weeks ago, and hotel rooms are $200 a piece, you know, a night kind of thing, are expensive from that perspective. We actually stayed in Big Spring and drove in at that time. But when it really gets down to how do you, the question is, how do you want to put out the flare? The smell in the Permian Basin is terrible, or in Midland is terrible. Well, there's three elements to carbon capture. There's the CO2 plant side, the CO2 pipeline infrastructure side, and then there's the reservoir storage and sequestration side. And when you talk about things in the Permian Basin, the things that what do you need in the Permian Basin most to make things work? And the main thing is power. So if you get down to power, then it gets back down to EPCOT in terms of what they reported in 2015 is that, yeah, Texas power increased by about 250 megawatts over the previous period, and it's expected to go up. But when you really look at Permian basins, that you need more power. You need more power. You need more power in order to make things work. So, you know, but then it gets back to how big, how much, how big, how are you going to do it? And then for me is that at which type of methodology that I can create electricity is that how can I put the flare out with it? So what I did was I looked at 6 plant options, and whether it's a Century plant and I'll go through each one of these in just a minute, is that of which of these methodologies can I use to really help things out in the Permian Basin? And then, and this is the first one. This is a Century plant. It exists in the Permian Basin. It was built by, or it's run by Oxy right now. Since 2011, it's the largest single industrial CO2 source capture facility in the United States. And it also qualifies for Q45 tax credits. And for tax credits, if it's for enhanced oil recovery, it's $35 a ton. If it's straight CO sequestration, it's $50 a ton. And this just came out within the last year or so. Well, for the final approval on it. But, oops, it doesn't put out the flare. And then you talk about shovel-ready projects that we had in the Permian Basin. And between 2005 2015, we had 2 Permian Basin power plant projects that were going to be initiated. They were designed, pursued, but later shelved. And one of them was a Texas Clean Energy Project in Odessa, and the other one was a Tenaska Trailblazer Project in eastern part of the Permian Basin. But the biggest problem with these projects is it's clean coal, and clean coal didn't make it in the Permian Basin from the standpoint. And the biggest problem is it doesn't put out the flare either. But it would have created jobs in Wyoming, jobs in West Texas. It really added values. So on about July 10th, I posted on LinkedIn, you know, my push, I should say, in regards to the clean coal projects, the Petronova, Texas Clean Project, and Tenaska. And when I look at the Petronova project in Taka, is with JP or JX Nippon, and that project in terms of going on was on budget, was on time, on budget, and it's working, and it's in west part of Houston, and it's a great project, tremendous project. But it deals with clean coal. And then, you know, if we got these things ready to go in the Clean Energy Project, it would have been the same type thing. At clean coal in West Texas. It would have made America great again. It would have created jobs. And then there's the Petronova plant, and that's what I was just talking about. And it came on budget, on time, you know, from that standpoint. JX Nippon is a part of this, and it's a really good effort. And then we talk about hydrogen solution. If the world goes down, everybody wants to go to electric cars. Well, right now they've got a truck out there that'll go 700 miles on a tank of hydrogen. But we only got 3 hydrogen places where we can, filling stations that you can actually fill up. But when you look at hydrogen down the road, it's an interesting type thing. And it's something we need to move to push towards, not just electric cars, but we really need to move into the hydrogen world. And then you've got Bob Dudley's vision in regards to that in terms of BP. You look at the Olympics in Japan, is that there was a big push in Japan to incorporate that. But the biggest problem with hydrogen, it still doesn't put the flare out. And then and then I've got hydrogen from that, and then we got projects around the world that are actually adding things to it. It's not the fact that we're on a learning curve, but we can generate hydrogen from natural gas without CO2 emissions. And there's companies, Linde tied into this, hydrogen from natural gas emissions in terms of that. People are actually looking at this and actually doing things. And then you got hydrogen inclusion also in terms of Linde's hydrogen solutions, that the complete technology, engineering, procurement, construction, source, your hydrogen, carbon monoxide, synthetic gas, ammonia, methanol needs. You guys are the experts in this area. You got, but I can generate hydrogen, CO2, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and CO2, and all these other kinds of things, along with hydrogen. Then you got direct air capture. Direct air capture is something new, basically. A lot of people don't do this, but there are projects. There's a greenhouse in Northern Europe that's sequestering CO2 out of the atmosphere in order to improve the greenhouse recoveries. And then now today we also got Oxy Low Carbon Ventures is also getting into this arena too in terms of the Permian Basin. But the problem with it doesn't put out the flare. And then also on the direct air capture, which I also think it's waste to synthetic fuels. Where can you take a waste and actually make something really useful out of it? Well, here we had a lady over here who's holding on a jar of synthetic fuel that was made out of air, basically, direct air capture. And then now the last thing I want to talk about is net power. And net power is got a facility just east of downtown where they're using oxy-fuel, alum cycle, in order to generate CO2, in order to generate electricity. Well, the neat thing about this is that, and this is Bill Brown and his team, they fired up for the first time their new alum cycle back in 2018. It burns hydrocarbon gas with oxygen. It makes CO2. Its carbon technology provides the best solution to put out the flare. Because I got all this gas going up in the air. What can I do with it? Oh, I can make electricity. So this is of all the different methodologies, and then there's also nuclear, from that standpoint. But nuclear still doesn't put out the flare. So I'm down here looking from a best solution standpoint. If I could get tied in with Bill Brown, and which they're also tied in with Oxy Permian too, is that if we build one of these facilities out there, then I can capture the flare gas in order to generate CO2. But when you really look at the Permian Basin right now, is that there's pipelines. There's six or seven different pipelines going out of the Permian Basin that head toward the Gulf Coast. So you can eliminate the flare by just sending it to the Gulf Coast. From that standpoint, make things from that standpoint. But what that does is it loses the capability of recovering enhanced oil recovery with CO2 under shale oil conditions. So I got a pipeline I've got all these pipelines coming out. I've got LNG plant with Exxon. I've got stuff going on, you know, Corpus Christi, and with all these new pipelines going in. So now, and then Permian Basin terms, you know, okay, pipelines going to the Gulf Coast. This is just an expansion off that. It's approximately 4 million barrels a day of new production capacity, 2 million barrels a day flowing to Corpus Christi, you know, on and on and on. Well, now, I want to talk about what is huff and puff for shale oil. What does that mean? It's primary oil recovery, as I mentioned. They go out there, they drill a well, and high pressure, they produce one cycle out of it. And they got to drill 20,000 wells in order to maintain production. So what is huff and puff? Huff and puff is a recovery process and a single well process that has been successfully implemented in conventional reservoirs for years. Now we're going to apply that to to the shale oil world, and we can inject either, you know, we can inject methane, but it's got a really high MMP, so you don't get as much oil recovery out of it. In fact, it's pretty small. But then you can move into ethane, propane, H2S, or a combination of CO2, C3 type stuff, we call Y-grade, and you inject that in the reservoir. And then how do you do it? Well, under huff and puff is an individual well process. It's a three-step process. You inject CO2 into the reservoir, into the well. You pressure it up to high pressure. It reacts with the formation. Compositionally wise, it pulls out all the NGLs and all the other oil out of that, and then you produce it. So here's your first, this would be primary. This is what you do the first time. Well, then you go back, so what I've done, here you go and inject CO2. You'll let the well shut in for a predetermined amount of time called a soak period. And then when the well is returned to production, and oil flows toward the well bore because of the pressure sink. And then when it bleeds down, then you go back and you do the second cycle, the third cycle, the fourth, the fifth, and there's a diminishing returns on this. But the whole idea on this is how much oil can I get beyond that first cycle? That first cycle is about 8% of the oil in place. And then, so then this gets back to what Oxy's been doing. They do a lot of reservoir modeling. Back in the early 80s, I did reservoir modeling for Amoco. I actually helped develop we call tapered WAG. I'm one of the forebearers, I guess, in regards to getting recovery from 8 to 12% up to 18 to 24%. But that was Amoco back in those days. Oxy Permian today have gone in and they've done lab experiments. And they've also gone back and done compositional modeling to see what the world would look like, you know, under CO2. And I won't get into all the details in regards to this, but I do want to point out is that under their modeling studies, that incremental oil under what I call an optimized case was 23% better than with a gross utilization rate. And I'm probably playing this too much of a reservoir engineer. But the optimized case huff and puff standpoint, I got an 81% higher rate recovery than I did under primary. And then under huff and puff, wedge was also showed a 250% increase compared to primary, if you include some natural fractures and some other things that are in the formation. So the bottom line on this is that Oxy proved that under shale oil situations is that if they do a huff and puff, they can get a lot more oil out than what there is today. So all these 20,000 wells that we drill a year, that after a year or 2 or 3 years are essentially depleted, is that now we can go back in and add CO2 to it and get a lot more oil out. So what will the Permian Basin look like in the year 2050? And then this gets into my study, and the reason I wrote my paper is that I looked at a 1,000 pads area. That represents an area that's 40 by 50 square miles. That's what that is. So each one of these is about a mile across. So I got 40 by 50 square miles of an area. It's got 1,000 pads, and and there are eight wells per pad. So there's 8,000 wells in that 40 by 50 square mile area. And so what would the CO2 storage capacity of this thing look like, located either in the Permian Basin or in the Eagle Ford from that standpoint? So I went back and made some assumptions. I assumed there's 1,000 drilling pads, and I assumed each drilling pad was 1 mile by 2 miles in drainage area, and you had 8 wells per pad. And I went back and assumed 5% of the active huff and puff and gas injection would be stored, retained. And if you go through 5 cycles, then you calculate about 4.5 TCF of gas. That's 4.5 trillion cubic feet of gas. It's really pretty significant. So, scoping model estimates: 4.5 trillion cubic feet of gas could be stored or sequestered in the ground permanently over a 40 by 50 square mile area, and the flare has been eliminated if I can use net power to do that. And then what this really deals with is that what I call a blueprint. And what a blueprint to me of this area is that it has all the elements in it and required in order to generate economics from this. Or what would you do? What do you need in order to put the flare out and double or triple your recovery out there? Well, it deals with optimization within the 40 by 50 square mile area. These are all wells and things like that, and patterns and things like that. It deals with what kind of equipment that you have out here. And then let's go ahead and put a net power, gas powered power plant up here. Well, okay, I need to have an oxygen source for it too. So I can put CO2 into this area. I can also put oxygen in this area, and I can use, besides using that plant, I can generate CO2 on site within here too. The technology today is beginning to drive that direction too. Now I want to move to the Gulf Coast. I don't know if this is going to be good or bad or indifferent.
Yeah, we usually stop around 9 p.m., Dave. Sorry to be the bad guy.
Okay. Well, I'm going to make this real quick.
Okay.
Boom, we're done. No. Question: how do we know CO2 will remain in the ground for 10,000 years? Well, you look at the United States, you look at the Permian Basin, you look at the Gulf Coast. Is that, yeah, we got 48 years of production history, and you look at this in the Permian Basin. Is that, as I mentioned earlier, these are 8,000 to 12,000 feet deep, with the total number of wells. There's nothing being, we have blowouts every once in a while, things like that, but there's no CO2 or anything that's leaking to the surface. And then San Andres Formation, there's 37,000 wells in the San Andres Formation out there. Do you hear in the newspapers or anything about leaks or things that could cause problems? No. And then you look at the Gulf Coast. Well, that's 12,300 fields along the Gulf Coast. Do you hear about blowouts? Do you hear about leaking back to the surface? You hear about all those kinds of things. So the not CO2, but gas and everything else, we do a pretty good job. And then if it breaks, we go fix it. And 10,000 years down the road, if we're still around, there'll probably be people that'll do that. Or if we go back to being hunter-gatherers and things like that, they just won't go to those areas that are, a few dead trees, things like that. So anyway, but Gulf Coast Evaluation 2050, the top 245 fields represent 50% of the total storage capacity, and that's of the 12,300 fields. And then you look at the 220 gigabyte, the storage capacity that still exists in the Gulf Coast. So we can put gas down there. We can put, different things. We can put different things down there. And then this is the last one I want to do is this is in Wyoming. In formations in Wyoming, Rock Springs uplift will hold about 500 years of CO2 storage. This is deep formations. So why not store, same place as what Mother Nature is intended? It's held helium, It's gas, it's hold all kinds of things. And if it can hold helium, then you know, it's going to stay there. And then it gets that back into solutions. Questions, what effects are currently being demonstrated around the world to reduce flare? You know, and it really gets down to waste energy projects. And if I went through a list of these, you know, in terms of global flaring, you know, it's increasing over the last 5 years. If I went into Global CCS Institute, you know, there's projects that are doing that from a carbon capture storage standpoint. And then when you get back into the World Bank, there's actually a zero flare initiative by 2030 to eliminate the flare. And I don't know if any of you guys have talked about that in Houston or not. This is what I call my initiative in trying to do that. So anyway, but then you got Saudi Arabia. They recognize that need. Now, they may be doing this from a political standpoint, but they plan on eliminating the flare by the year 2030 also. And then you got Wyoming Dry Fork. This is a project that captures not CO, or that capture stack gas, runs it through a pipeline, or outloads it along a pipeline facility. And this project is great because it's a modernization type plant. And, you know, they've already got the mercury and the smog, all the other kind of stuff out, but they still have, you know, what are you going to do with the CO2? And what are you going to do in Wyoming, which is heavily coal driven? Well, they put together what they call an event by 2020, Integrated Test Center, is that they call a Carbon X Prize. It's a contest to eliminate, to try to go figure out what you can use for the waste gas comes out of the stack. How can you convert it to CO2? Can you convert it to other things? And then along this line this is what I'm talking about. They've got an area. They've got pipeline comes down, and they've got these project areas that are maybe 5 or 6 acres or something like that. And there's actually a group that came in, and then if it doesn't go there, then the gas can go back into the deep formations. But anyway, this is a project, or they've also got Colorado-based TDA research is already doing this in order to win the X Prize. And then there's Oxy Low Carbon Ventures in terms of stuff that's going on. They're trying to do biomass to fuels projects. So to me, it gets back to waste and energy. You got ICEF, which is an organization too, and you know, in terms of decarbonization, that they're trying to develop roadmaps. One of them is industrial heat carbonization. The other one is direct air capture. And the third one here is CO2 utilization. You know, looking for solutions. How do you solutions in regards to what you do in the field? And even Chevron's got pursuing a direct air capture project. So what's next on the agenda, Tom? Climate Solutions Community was formed to reach out across bridges to address and find climate solutions for today's climate issues. And what I wanted to do is look at this, is that, yeah, I'm building bridges over here so that we all meet here in the middle and you know, bring our best of the best from both sides of the fence. So can we form a collaborative group within a Climate Solutions Committee to eliminate the flare in the Houston Metroplex complex? Oh, you guys aren't throwing spears at me yet, so that's okay. Well, then there's Mayor Turner, Houston Climate Action Plan. Is there any way that we can eliminate Houston's flare to be part of that Climate Action Plan? We'll try. Okay. And then what's next in the future? Goal, let's put out the flare. The clock is ticking. And thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Any questions? Any questions? No questions. All right. Well, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Really appreciate it.
me on this.
See Yurica for season pass. See Yurica for season pass. I don't have anything else, so hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the evening and a safe trip home. Thank you.